so how many of you heard about European citizenship? Let's have like a repetition session. I know that you had some European citizenship lecture today in the morning, but let's speak about the basics first, because my intervention assumes that you know something about it, and I want to be sure. So, what is European citizenship?
So you have citizenship in one of the member states of the European Union, and that confers like kind of European citizenship. Also, like by how the passport is given, it's like a European Union passport, and then you have your national citizenship as well.
And what is the added value then? What is the added value?
You can live and work in any of the member states. You're a citizen of the EU as well.
Okay, and does the European Union play any role in conferring the status? Where does the status come from? Is it simply national citizenships that work together, or? Okay, so when we speak about citizenship, there are usually several elements that we look at. What are those key elements? You already mentioned all the key elements right away, actually. So what are the key elements of citizenship as a status? Well, as a status, as an option. What are those?
One key element is being able to work and live in the country.
Well, let's generalize. Move up in your thinking about the key elements.
To be able to legally live in the country or within the union.
Yeah.
You must be a citizen of a EU member state in order to have EU citizenship.
So we have two aspects of two key elements. What are those elements now? You gave one example, If you generalize a little bit, just thinking about any citizenship in the world, a citizenship is a combination of several important factors.
Where
You
you're
mentioned
born.
one,
Maybe
but
where you're born.
that's a second example of the factor that you mentioned, and we had several examples. You mentioned the first factor. Yeah.
Thinking like legal status, political rights.
Yeah, well, political rights. Let's forget about political for a second. But there is a status, and there are rights. Anything we are forgetting? So you see what I'm speaking about. Now we generalize a little bit. So you gave an example of a right. You gave an example of a right. We can come up with 100 more rights. You spoke about how to get the status. You named it the status. You also hinted at the status. So these are two different aspects of citizenship, which are both important. What is the third one?
Responsibility, what you pay into the system.
Pardon?
What you pay into the system, responsibilities.
Are we speaking about corporations, like the citizenship of Volkswagen? But if you are poor, should you be despised and refused the rights and kicked out from the list of those who have a status? We are less harsh in Europe. So what else? Are you proud when you see a flag? Yeah.
A sense of belonging in a society.
Yeah, well, some people have that. Let's quote identity. So there are these three. Oops.
That's the identity.
And yeah, because I disagree that identity should play a role. Usually, as we will see, identity is used as a justification to disconnect those who have a legitimate claim to status and to rights from the enjoyment of both. So, like, unfortunately, your identity is not good enough. You speak this strange language, or your accent is bizarre, or you were born in a territory which is not entirely incorporated into our state. So basically, you are second class, fair enough, forget about the benefits of citizenship. That's how identity usually works. It can also be presented in a positive way, so no problem with that. And so how do these three work at the national level with any classical citizenship? Usually the state will give you the status, then if you have the status in the eyes of the state, the state will provide you with some rights, and then ideally you will also feel the sense of, like, you will be graced by the state, that you're recognized as belonging to that state. Then what is the difference with the EU? You gave me the official story, yeah.
What about your duties as a citizen? I think that's what this.
We will speak about the duties. I didn't include them because they are not in the classical literature. Let's put it that way. But the talk was announced as the duties talk, so I will honor the promise. Don't worry about that. So let's just look at the differences between the actual functioning and the legal framing of EU citizenship on the one side and the nationalities of the member states on the other. So the nationalities of the member states will work exactly like any other citizenship around the world. So who gives the status there and how? How do you become a citizen of, for instance, Burkina Faso?
Well, it depends. I know with some countries, they require that you have to be born in that country for them to grant you citizenship.
So the rest, again, let's generalize first. It's always nice to start with a general principle and then give examples. So being born in a country, great example. Could you either come up with a principle or give more examples? I'm sorry, it's not really a talk. It seems like I'm trying to get something from you. Like this, you don't fall asleep. Yeah.
I think other two, there's like EU Soltera and EU Sanguinis, so like you can be born there or you can be naturalized there.
Yeah, but you sanguinis is not naturalization. What is that?
Oh, based on blood.
Yeah. So you named three then.
Oh.
Naturalization, blood, or territory. How do European states confer their citizenships? Well, this is a very basic story. In fact, there are hundreds of ways to acquire citizenship. Can you give more examples than those three?
You can be a refugee, right? You can seek asylum,
And what?
ask for shelter from your bad political situation.
No, you can ask. I mean, I can go and sweep the street. What is the relation with what we're speaking about? We're speaking about these three. So how does you seeking asylum entitle you to a status of citizenship in a particular polity? You can ask for naturalization. So we come back to the three already outlined. But there are other ways if nothing comes to mind.
Through marriage.
Well, through marriage, sometimes by registrations through marriage you could acquire citizenship. And the function was to ensure that women lose their nationality as long as they marry foreign. So if you're unfaithful to your country and to your people, then get out of here and you will never be able to return. That's how it functioned until the 70s, the 80s actually, all the developed world as it were. And non-developed world is still non-developed. So that's how the status works. We have several ways to acquire the status, and then ideally, once you have acquired the status in the eyes of the law, you will be able to claim rights based on that status. How do you acquire the status at the European level? Someone already mentioned that. So how do you become a citizen of the EU?
Well, doesn't it just go hand in hand with your, like, member state citizenship? Like on the
Yeah, so
passport
it's
it says European Union and then you're given member state.
Yeah, so while in theory the idea of the status is there, the way how we acquire it is totally different. Because it's derivative acquisition. And you can call it jus tractum to mimic the Latin language of the other ones. So some polities previously would also recognize derivations. But the EU now is the most important one doing this. So you have your EU citizenship by law of the European Union, and it's derived from the nationalities of the member states. Who then decides whether you are an EU citizen? Well, the member states give their status, and the European Union came up with this use tractum thing. So it's derivative. But the question then arises, when the status is derivative, are the rights derivative? Well, the question basically is, does European citizenship exist at all, if it's so derivative? Does it have anything to itself, besides the nationalities of the member states? Does it or not? I mean, you just say something. I mean, it doesn't matter what. And then we will take it from there.
Well, there's a court system, right? So if you're discriminated against, for example, for being a minority or a woman, you can take it to the EU legal system.
Well, you could, but you could also say that you can do it on the basis of your rights of a national in a different member state. Let's look at the nature of rights that correspond to the status. Several examples were given. Well, what are the most classical rights that are usually associated with citizenship? The most standard list.
Right to vote.
Everybody starts with the right to vote. What is so political? I mean, imagine all those hundreds of thousands of people like now take those non-seaworthy boats to cross the Mediterranean. They don't do it to vote. No, I mean they can do it for the idea of freedom, whatever, however you present. They're not interested in electing Berlusconi yet another time, for instance, if they're heading to Italy. So, right to vote, it's great, it's wonderful. We're in America, the land of the free, but it's a luxury, which plenty of people cannot actually afford thinking about. The majority of countries in the world are not democracies, and they still have their citizenship, as it were, and they still have the rights associated with that status. They govern themselves somehow. It's great to have a democracy, but those will not be the core rights, which are the most important for us as citizens. I mean, depends on how ideological you are. But you become really ideological once you have something to it, if you are Marxist, yeah.
But if you're thinking of human rights, that would be...
Human rights,
important,
I mean...
or like the freedom of speech or something that's very important, and you don't have the right to vote. So whether or not you have that super important right, you cannot hold the government accountable. So even if you have it and the government violates it, so the right to vote is kind of important too.
You said it all. Human rights are not necessarily citizenship rights. So let's, I'm sorry I'm picking on the language, but I asked for citizenship rights. So those rights that only belong to the holders of particular status of citizenship that is granted by the authorities of particular territory. So what are those? Let's ask someone else.
Is it the right, one of the rights could be the right to reside or live in? that
Yeah,
region?
so that's why they take the boats. I mean, this is the usual core association between the status and what people want to take for granted. Is the right to be in your country, and there's the right to work in your country, and there's the right in the majority of cases not to be deported from your country. Because a foreigner, no matter what kind of residence documents the foreigner has, can always be kicked out. And kicking out the citizen is extremely difficult. So if you compare simple human rights or human rights of long-term residents with the rights of citizens, which are only granted to those who have the status of citizenship, then the list will not be long. But that list will start and will end in an ideal polity with the rights of residence and work. Because in fact, it makes, if you look at it a little bit open-mindedly, it makes no sense to connect citizenship with political representation. And if we look through history, this connection has not been made in 100% of cases, either in this country or elsewhere, or in Europe. And there are still plenty of examples of countries all around the world, the European Union included, where political representation is not limited to the citizens of the place. What is the biggest EU member state where that is the case? So give me an example of an EU member state where you don't need to be a citizen to be elected to any level of representation, basically, or participate in elections. Imagine you want to sit on the House of Lords. Do you need to be British? No. Of course not. So, because the British idea is, if you pay taxes, you have to be somehow participating in the way how the society functions. Of course, it's limited by their history, etc. So now, under the law as it stands, you need to hold one of the Commonwealth nationalities, and you need to be a resident in the country. So, like, you're Mozambican, you recognize somehow the authority of Her Majesty the Queen, although Mozambique has a very dubious connection with the Commonwealth, of course, being a member, not historically being a member. You can be elected to the House of Lords. You can be elected to the European Parliament, not being a European citizen. And under British law, your connection with the polity will not be put in question simply because your status is not there, the status of a citizen of the polity. So the status corresponds to rights, and the list of rights is not long. And then let's look at what kind of rights are those. Are the rights of EU citizenship in any way different from the rights of the nationalities of the member states?
You can travel easier. You can travel without.
But is traveling really a citizenship right?
It's different than just a nation state's rights. You can move from Germany to Hungary easier if you are an EU member than you are if you are not.
Why? There is no border. If I take my Russian passport, if I had one, I used to, then I could benefit from this borderless arrangement just as much as the Europeans would.
That's not true, because you couldn't work.
Exactly. So then travel and free movement in the understanding of the EU has there's a fundamental difference. This is this work component. And this work component is always part of the national status. But where does it come from in the EU? Is it really national level law or EU level law? I'm still trying to find out whether European Union citizenship exists as something tangible and real, or on the contrary, whether it can be presented as something purely derivative and basically ephemeral. Because we've seen the status as absolutely derivative. So if you're a Frenchman, then you are a European citizen. And then if you're a Frenchman, you have you have French rights. And then how special and different are European rights compared with your French rights? What is the added value of the rights that are granted to you by the EU? Is there any added value? You had the lecture on citizenship in the morning. Convince me that it's worthwhile speaking about it at all. You wanted to say something.
Yeah, no, I was thinking, even if it doesn't have an added value in terms of right, you can still have like a social identity that you identify yourself with being a European or a member of the European Union.
That's the problem with identity. Does it need to be sanctioned by the state or by a public authority in order to be there? Like imagine you give up your nationality, whatever nationality you have. For instance, tomorrow you become German, you're not American anymore. Does it make you less of an American? Will you like German cookies more than American cookies? How does the state enter this equation? Do you need the sanction of the state to feel in a particular way? Plenty of people would argue that they don't. Like, I'm not less of a Russian because I'm not Russian in the eyes of the law of the Russian state. And plenty of people went through this kind of perturbations. So in the majority of cases, it happens to be like this, that you hold the identity, which also corresponds to the sanctioned status. But it doesn't have to be the case.
Well, that's what I was going to say. Is just because the state, you don't need the state to form an identity, doesn't mean that the state or this public entity can't help form an identity.
Of course it can, and
Which
this
is
is what they've been trying hard to do.
Right.
But it's an open question whether the European Union is trying hard to do that. That was the reason for putting the European citizenship on the books in the first place. Like the European Union was trying to solve its identity crisis. That's why in order to be closer to the people, the European Union comes up with this idea of European citizenship. But does it actually work like this is an open question. It works at a different level. And I come back to rights again. So you already mentioned the most important rights, basically, that European citizens have. And that's the right to work, to live, to travel around all the territory of the European Union. Can that right come from the national level statuses directly? No, why not?
Because a single nation state cannot grant you the right to travel or work in another country.
Think in terms of,
as easily.
yeah, that's absolutely correct. Think in terms of sovereignty. Sovereignty is territorial. The US can do whatever it wants in its own territory and in terms of granting rights which will be connected to this territory. But the US cannot do anything about Puerto Rico, yes, or Micronesia, but not about Germany or Japan. So you cannot simply use US law in order to grant US citizens rights to work and reside in Japan for an unlimited duration of time. You need a different level of authority to do that. And this is where the EU comes in. So in fact, the EU would actually grant you the same rights as your nation state would. But the scope of the rights will be entirely different. Which means that EU authority is able to overcome the territorial limitations of the member states and operate in the scope of Europe, in the scope of the Union, as opposed to the nationalities of the member states, which are limited to a particular state. So as an Estonian, or as a German, or as a Dutch person, a Portuguese, there is a huge added value there, because you have your national level status, which is associated with national level rights, which are limited by the territorial nature of the national sovereignty, and then the EU comes on top and grants you a different status, which is directly connected to what you already have, this jus tractum logic. But the essence of the rights will be absolutely different, because they will not be limited by the objective limitations of what your state could grant you. So in terms of scale, we're speaking about factor 28 increase in how you can benefit from the two statuses that basically always come together. And then in this sense, of course, the added value is absolutely clear. What is the main right on that list? We didn't mention the key, the cornerstone right of citizenship. Like political participation, great. And what I have in mind actually is connected to political participation.
Education? Education?
I don't know how it's connected to citizenship.
Well, I mean, you're entitled to a free education as part of your...
Or not, it depends on how the polity construes the package of rights. But if we think about the the rights which are indispensable for the actual operation of citizenship in any polity anywhere in the world, then education will not be part of that package. Because there are plenty of successful states where, well, without any education. If we want an obscurantist theocracy, then we give a status to everybody. Of course, they can reside in the territory of our obscurantist theocracy. I mean, probably we will judge them harshly from our perspective what enlightenment means, but they will judge us as harshly from their own obscurantist perspective. But what is so what is the main added value of citizenship historically? How is it different from any other societal organization? Like, was there citizenship in the feudal times?
It's kind of like equality, essentially?
Yeah. So I was looking for like a buzzword, but it makes sense. Why?
Because it's what distinguishes citizens from feudal times, I guess, is that it's kind of a horizontal set of rights that everybody enjoys the same regardless of whatever their status, besides their citizenship status, whatever their socioeconomic status or whatever else.
So citizenship is sold to us as a status of equals. Once we're speaking about a caste system, there is no place for a legitimate use of the word citizenship anymore in that context. So European Union citizenship will then also grant you equality, but it will work in a totally different way compared with equality in the national context. Because the national context equality is only limited to the holders of the national level status, which means that under the French Constitution, all the French are the same. Or under the Czech Constitution, all the Czechs are the same. Not the Portuguese, not the Estonians, not the Greeks. And the European Union then puts it on, like, it totally reverses the whole thing. Because in the European Union, equality means equality among the holders of the European level status. What are the implications for the nationalities of the member states then? This is when we come to conflict a little bit. And we need conflict in order to demonstrate to ourselves that EU citizenship actually makes sense as something that has its own plight, its own right to existence next to the national level statuses. Because as you started, this derivative blah blah, it's absolutely correct that it is. But it has nothing to say about the essence of this legal status. So knowing that EU citizenship prohibits discrimination on the basis of particular nationalities of the European Union, what is its relationship with the national level statuses?
It's making them all equal. But like, having EU citizenship from a certain member country doesn't make you better than another EU citizen from a different member country. Because you all have the
Yeah,
same
this
legal
is
rights.
this is how it works in practice. What are the implications for the national levels? For the national level statuses? Making them all equal sounds great. We're all Democrats here, not in the US and the States. I mean, we believe that it's a good thing to start with equality rather than with slavery or caste systems, etc. But the trouble is, what is the starting idea of citizenship, given that equality is a right? Is the starting idea of citizenship as that of equality?
Well, it's equality within a bounded space, right? And if there's two competing ideas of citizenship that are incompatible to some extent, because one calls for equality within a bounded space and one calls for equality across.
It's not about space in the sense of territory. It's space in the sense of the holders of the status. So equality among the French citizens means that all those who are not French citizens are not equal by definition. So the core right of citizenship, which is part of the notion, like part of the definition, is equality. But then the core implication of that is that all those who don't hold the status of equals are inferior by definition, they cannot be included as equals. This is how the law works in all the member states of the European Union. And then what does European citizenship do with that? Suddenly, we are told that the Greeks are not worse than the French. It's an offense in the eyes of French law. It goes against the core of what the French state is about. Because suddenly we are reminded that the French state doesn't love its own Frenchmen and French women more than a filthy foreigner. So it's a scandal. And it's a total conflict. And it's good to have such a conflict because it reminds us of how problematic the nature of citizenship actually is at the national level. And once the conflict is, once we start thinking about this conflict seriously, we realize that actually all the national level statuses, although European citizenship is derived from them, are becoming fictitious because they promise us exclusion and equality, this duo, which doesn't actually overlap with reality, given that European Union law has a claim to supremacy and direct effect. So any time when the French law says we should give a preference to a Frenchman or to a French woman, it can always be automatically overruled by another rule coming from the supranational legal order, which means that those statements are empty statements. And what are the statements I'm speaking about? These are the core elements of the national constitutions of the member states. This is the promise that all the Frenchmen are equal. This is the promise that all the Dutchmen are equal. They cannot be lived up to in the EU system because suddenly the scope of the holders of the status, like what you termed as territory, or is entirely different than the EU. And obviously it affects the way how the nationalities of the member states operate at all the levels. And the most interesting level is access to the status. Like you started quite rightly, based on the text of the treaties, that EU citizenship is derivative. But now if you look at how acquisition of nationality rules actually work at the national level, 20 years after EU citizenship was introduced. It was introduced into the Treaty of Maastricht for the first time in the 90s. You will discover that if we speak about naturalization, something that a person actively seeks admission to a certain society in terms of status. So once we speak about naturalization, the majority of the member states have different naturalization rules depending on who is asking for admission and what will be the main distinction then between the applicants. You might not know this, but it could become obvious based on the conflict which I outlined. So is it easier or, yes?
So would the main difference just be how the person naturalized rather than like if if the citizenship means the same thing in every country, but the countries have different processes of naturalization, then the only difference between those citizens of different countries is how they naturalize.
Well, in general in Europe it's prohibited to discriminate between citizens on the basis of how they acquire the status. But the rules of acquisition of the status are different. But let's return back a couple of steps. So we have this conflict which tells us that constitutions of all the member states have an empty promise at the core of statehood, which is the promise of equality among the holders of a particular status, while we know that EU law prohibits them from making this promise. So by virtue of EU law, and it actually works, there's a lot of case law from the Court of Justice on the discrimination on the basis of nationality. It is actually prohibited. So any member state that makes a claim of equality based on its own status is making a false claim. And then we know that those statuses, supranational statuses, are derivative from the statuses of the nationality of the member state. This derivation could not survive as claimed in the treaties, obviously. So now when you are naturalizing, a member state will first look at whether you are a European citizen already. Which means that, of course, it's a derivative status, but the status derived from the nationalities of the member states actually profoundly affects the way how you acquire the national level belonging. So to give you an example, if you come from Nigeria and you want to naturalize in Rome, it will take you at least 10 years of permanent residence and paying taxes, and you never have to be on any kind of welfare. While if you come from Amsterdam with a Dutch passport to the same city and take residence in the same street next to that Nigerian, it will take you 5 years and admission will be automatic. And this is how it works in now almost half of the member states. The member states realized that while there is a claim to derivation, in fact, the essence of their statehood is affected profoundly by the derived status. So it simply makes no sense to pretend that naturalization and admission to the status means the same for different groups of people. And then the only distinction between those groups is whether they are EU citizens or not. This is not something that you will hear in the constitutional debates in the member states. This is not something that the Commission will tell you. But if you just read the law, you will discover that actually this derivation has two ends. And European citizenship, since it's a fundamental provider of extremely important rights which the member states cannot directly grant, actually started functioning in such a way that although it's officially derived, in practice, the other way around is also possible. So it's just a small footnote on how European citizenship works. And now this is the practice, this is the day-to-day. And now we go into the literature on European citizenship. And the literature usually tells us that it is not a real citizenship status, either in terms of status or in terms of rights, because it cannot command true allegiance of those who hold it, since there are no duties of citizenship that would be connected to it. And this is not something that I invented. I think I distributed the link to an article in EU Citizenship Without Duties. The claim is not, let's not have the duties. The claim is, come down to earth theorists and actually look at what EU citizenship is and how it functions. Does it really need to have those duties which everybody's looking in order to become real? Or is it already doing important things which allow us to claim its reality even without those bizarre duties which a number of people are seeking? And the literature is absolutely clear on it. My article is the only one, and I'm absolutely sure I'm telling you the truth now, that actually questions the need to have the duties of European citizenship at the supranational level. Because the consensus is absolute. And if I were not around, then the consensus would be perfect. It would be 100%. Am I sad that there are no duties? In the light of what I told you, and in the light of the conflict I described, actually it should become clear that EU citizenship is not as simple as the picture that the treaties paint. It is much more sophisticated at the level of its operation. And it's much more problematic, actually, for the member states because it removes it removes the core claims. It makes them illegitimate. The core claims of statehood, which we find in all the constitutions, and which we find in all the ideological presentations of nationhood at the national level. But moving one step back from this, from duties for one more second, let's think about what is the unique right or the unique aspect of nationality of the member states that the European Union citizenship cannot provide. What is the added value of holding the national status as opposed to the supranational one? Is there any? Like, imagine you're Estonian, and can you give me an example of an Estonian right which is not, which doesn't have a corresponding mirror right at the supranational level that would empower you even better than the Estonian level, empowerment? Try to, like, usually people try to justify EU citizenship, and this was my task from the very beginning. Let's try to see that it actually has a value beyond derivation. Derivation is, if you don't think about citizenship at all, then derivation will be your story. It doesn't correspond to reality. Now we have seen that citizenship actually has an added value as such at the supranational level. So let's reverse our intellectual exercise and try to justify the nationalities of the member states. In the words of Gareth Davis, there is a famous professor at VU Amsterdam, nationalities of the member states are abolished within the scope of application of EU law because discrimination on the basis of nationality is prohibited. So the member states are prohibited from treating their own citizens better than the citizens of any other member state, any other EU citizen. Then what is the unique twist about the nationalities of the member states that will either help us as nationals or make our lives more difficult? And then we go back to duties.
Oh, well, there's no like European like draft for an army. So if you're an Estonian citizen and France decides to go to war, you can't be drafted by France, even though you're an EU citizen to fight for
I
that
will tell
country.
you more, you cannot be drafted by anyone because EU law has precedent. So if you don't feel like joining the Estonian army, imagine you don't give a damn about Estonia. Right, so I remember, identity works in different ways. There are hippies, there are vagabonds, there are simply people who avoid the draft. What it takes to do in the European system is to walk over the non-existent border to Latvia. Can Estonians ask you to come back and to serve? Of course not, because you have exercised the supranational level right. The supranational level exercise of right takes precedent over the national duties. And there is case law on this, related to the Greeks. The Greeks are very notorious. They wouldn't renew your passport, for instance, before you served. And then the case I have in mind involved a Greek who spent 10 years in Germany as a high school teacher. And then at a certain point, he receives a letter from Greece saying, we feel, although we are both NATO members, we feel threatened by the Turks, so come join the military, please. And in order to make it a better story for you, by the way, we will not renew your passport, so you will have to come and thank you for exercising your right in serving in the Greek military. He went to court, and the court then obliged the German authorities to issue him with a German residence permit based on an expired passport, because the Greek perception of threat from the Turks cannot possibly take precedence above the rights of EU citizenship, which are in the treaties. The treaties have a supranational value, and they have a high authority. At least that's how the official story goes. That supersedes the authority of the national institutions and national law in the member states. But let's come back to the question. So, what is the added value of your nationality as a nationality of a particular state, as opposed to a supranational status of EU citizenship, which is derived from that nationality. You better be quick, we only have 10 minutes.
Well, I don't know if this is true, but I mean, what about the welfare state? Like, do you have as a national citizen, you have a right to receive like a pension from your nation, like once you retire?
Well, it depends. There are different types of pensions.
Yeah.
It's a complicated area of law, but usually it's territorially defined. So the state where you spent your life working will be responsible for your pension, and there is no automatic overlap between that and your status of nationality. But it can play a role. That's one of those important aspects we need to take into account. There are some more obvious examples. Positive and negative. Can you give us the positive one?
Going back to your question, Morris, that the EU is not necessarily a static entity, and all this talk about the Greek exit means that this EU citizenship is not necessarily permanent, whereas a national identity.
No citizenship is permanent. I come from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union doesn't exist. I still have the Soviet passport. So let's not speak about permanence. Let's speak about reality. So from the point of view of reality, what is the added value of the nationality of a member state as opposed to EU citizenship level? Think about, yeah.
Well, I mean, you're not gonna like this, but if you're actually living in the country where you hold the passport, then you have access to education, at least. I mean, this is wrapped up in what kind of language you speak, right? But if you're a French person living in France, you can send your kids to French-speaking schools. You can't have that privilege in other places.
Well, you can always send your children to school in any country where you reside in the European Union.
But not necessarily in the language.
It will not be your French-speaking school unless there is a French-speaking school in the area. Yeah, because in Belgium you can send your children to a French-speaking school. In the Netherlands you can. I think in all the large member states you can. There are European schools that will educate in a number of different languages of the European Union. But that's a positive kind of example. There is another side. Let's not dwell on this any longer. If you want to be the head of state, that's the most basic example. Or like head of government rather, because plenty of heads of state don't have, or have plenty of other citizenship. Like the Dutch Queen has a British passport. President Barroso had a Brazilian passport, etc. So there is no exclusive understanding of this correspondence between the passport and the head of state. But if you want to be a head of government, you absolutely need to have the local passport. And the same applies to some key positions in the governing structure of your state. It doesn't apply to ordinary positions in the ministries, etc. So that's one added value. That's the positive one. But the negative one is more telling. Have you heard about reverse discrimination? And that's the most important aftertaste that your nationality can give you, and it's profoundly against you. Reverse discrimination, no, doesn't ring a bell.
Well, so I'm not sure if this is exactly the example that you're thinking of, but I'm pretty sure if you're a Danish citizen, for instance, that you get education funds that are portable, I guess, that you could get money to go somewhere else.
The same with the Dutch, the same with the Germans.
Right.
I mean, it depends on how your state
But
is
you can't
organized.
just apply for that as an EU citizen, not from Denmark, I think is what I mean.
No, it's not connected to citizenship. It's connected to residence. So if you hold a permanent residence of a place, you're treated like a national. So if I travel to Denmark and live there for 5 years, I will automatically be issued a permanent residence permit. And then if I have a child then, and the child is a child of a permanent resident who is an EU national, the child will be treated like a Danish person. This is how non-discrimination works. Sometimes it takes some time to earn permanent residence. Usually it's 5 years. But after 5 years, no discrimination is possible. This is not what I had in mind. Reverse discrimination is about treating your own citizens who don't have any connection with the EU level of the law worse. It's something that flows directly from the idea of non-discrimination based on nationality. Imagine your constitution tells you you need to ensure that all the Frenchmen are equal, and then the treaties at the European level prohibit discrimination based on nationality. It means that you cannot treat a Portuguese person worse than a Frenchman under your constitution, or a Greek person worse than a Frenchman under your constitution. But what you can do, you can tweak your constitution by interpreting it in such a way that you can, in order to regulate differently, in order to be special, in order to ensure that the Frenchmen still have this national bond, you can limit the number of rights of your own nationals who have never moved to any other member state. Which means that you will have two levels of regulation. The equal rights will apply to all your own nationals who moved and lived in other member states of the EU, and to all the EU citizens who come from other member states and chose your country as their permanent place of residence. But then there will be a second layer of those who are not actually entitled to full rights. And those will be your own citizens who never moved. And then you can legislate only for them. And that legislation will not apply to any of your own nationals who actually are covered by EU law directly. This is called reverse discrimination. The most basic example, you're a Dutch person and you fall in love in Colombo. Then if under EU law, as an EU citizen, there is an automatic right for family reunification. So your wife or your husband will be entitled to a long-term residence permit based on your family relation and will be able to travel to Europe and live with you. Under Dutch law, it's prohibited to import a husband or a wife, basically. Theoretically, it's possible, because that person needs to pass a basic level Dutch exam at the Dutch embassy in the country of origin. Try to find the Dutch teacher in Colombo. Think about how much it will cost and how much time it will take. And then once you import your spouse into the Netherlands under the national rules, there will be no automatic access to the job market. There will be thousands of levels of national integration exams, etc. So nobody does it. And you will only be under the national rules if you cannot demonstrate that there is a connection between your situation and supranational law. The easiest way to establish this connection is to show that you have worked abroad or you have benefited in the past from your EU level rights. Cross-border work, study abroad, anything you want. There are no strict rules of how much of that you need to show. So for the majority of people, it's enough to travel across the border to Belgium and to work in McDonald's part-time for 6 months. What is the consequence of that? Dutch law doesn't apply to you. And then you benefit from basic equal standard that stems directly from the EU level. So then, this is just one example. There are thousands of others in different fields of law. Once again, since the member states cannot privilege their own nationals, the only thing they can do is to harm the life chances of their own nationals. And you would think, as the Court of Justice thought, refusing to enter into this debate on the grounds of equality at the EU level, that the member states would not be interested in doing this. But in fact they are. So the absolute majority of the member states have chosen to limit the rights of their own nationals who don't directly, whose situation does not directly connect to EU law, and they chose to not to apply the national constitutional standards of equality to that group of people. That group of people is the absolute majority of EU citizens. So the absolute majority of EU citizens do not actually benefit directly from the equality claims under EU citizenship because of this power reserve that the member states negotiated for themselves in being able to regulate the situations which are not directly concerned with EU law. So the biggest added value of your nationality as the nationality, not as a status that simply gives you access to the supranational status of EU citizenship, is negative. It means that you cannot be treated equally to those EU citizens who actually live a high-flying life of moving around and who held jobs in other member states of the EU. And so this is the reality of EU citizenship. And I don't have much time for the duties, but I'm not sad because you have the article anyway. But the basic claim of the article is that it's absurd to speak about duties first when the context of EU citizenship is so much more complex than what plenty of scholars actually outline, and also given the history of duties. And I make two arguments of how that history of the use of duties actually doesn't fit within the modern understanding of personhood and law. Because there are only two functions that duties used to play. The first one is the uniformization of society, the building of the national identity, which means that you brand out whole groups as deficient. And the second one, which is related to the first, is keeping the status quo. So ensuring that citizenship is extending in terms of granting rights to more and more groups as slowly as possible. How does it work? The best explanation is what Chief Justice Steiny said in Dred Scott. If you cannot bear the full weight of duties, you should not be entitled to the rights that come from the state, no matter what kind of status you hold. Who determines then whether you can bear the full weight of duties? It's the state that provides you with the status and with the rights. So in Dred Scott, there was a black person potentially of U.S. citizenship. That was the case was about whether a black person can really be a citizen. And the Chief Justice writes, since in all our legislation, we see that you need to be a white, able-bodied male in order to serve on the militia, and serving on the militia is the main duty of a citizen, it's impossible to say, either in fact or in law, that a black person can potentially or actually assume any duties because he is black, as we all see, which means that it would be most unreasonable and repugnant from the point of view of the law to extend any rights to that person. The same applies to women. We cannot draft women into militias, so the soldier-citizen tradition doesn't apply to them because they have nothing to give to the state. If you have nothing to give to the state, then why would you ask anything back? This is how duties work during the history of state building. And this is the example of using duties as in order to ensure that citizenship rights don't extend to everybody. The first example that I have given automatically excludes different categories of citizens. So there is a great body of writing. I'm going a little bit over time. 2 more minutes. There's a great body of writing by Professor Engin Isin, who is in England now, but he's Turkish-Canadian, and he divides all the citizens into active, activist, and passive. And the claim is very basic. The state only sees the citizens it wants to see, like only seeing white, able-bodied men, not women, not racial or religious minorities, not gay couples, etc. Those are not good enough, and in order to justify that they're not good enough, we can use the ideology of duties. But we can also use the ideology of duties to disregard those who are too actively engaged in promoting their ideal of a good society, of living together, which does not correspond to what the state wants to see. imagine you refuse to join the Israeli army, to fight in the Palestinian territories. Are you a good citizen? You're a horrible citizen in the eyes of the Israeli state. In fact, you're committing a crime. But probably if you have a different idea of Israel in your head, and you share it with your compatriots, you can also be presented as an activist citizen who is defying a duty while fighting for a better life for all by trying to promote a different idea of society. So that's an activist citizen. The ideology of duties brands them out as deficient. Now think about the passive citizens. You smoke pot and you're not interested. You have a fulfilling life. You have your lover or two. You live in a simple bungalow. You serve. And then you're frowned upon because you don't really participate in the creation of a better society as defined by the state. So this is something that both in democracies and in totalitarian societies is seen as unacceptable behavior. So think about the Soviet Union reality. If you don't really love the party, if you are not really actively engaged in building the Soviet future for everybody as defined by the Soviet state, then you should be punished. And people were actually punished for doing things which the state would not regard as active work. Nobel Prize-winning poet Brodsky, in his exile to Siberia, for being a lazy layabout because he wrote poetry, is a great example. What is it? It's turning duties against those who have a different idea of society. And then if we look at all the history of how duties work, as I said, duties have a very clear function in shaping the citizen that the state wants to see, muting any kind of dissent, and removing any kind of claims of inclusion from the groups who de facto fail to benefit from citizenship because of the way how the state or the authority constructs it. And then the conclusion of my article, I adore the situation that there are no duties of citizenship in the EU because the EU is decapacitated on this plane from branding huge groups of people as deficient simply by way of how its law is constructed. So I applaud the fact that there are no duties of citizenship, and I think European citizenship has a better story to tell than the story of duties, which the majority of scholars do more. So thank you very much.